Hello, and welcome to the next episode of In Bed with Books. Today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a mini review on the book What the River Knows by Isabel Ibanez. This came out October of last year, and it had been on my list for a while. It had the kind of, I guess, like a niche that I was really interested in, and I finally picked it up over the summer, and I beyond loved it. This is not sponsored, gifted, or anything. This is just me wanting to info dump about a book that I really loved. So it was, first of all, a beautiful book, beautiful, beautiful cover. And some of the art that has come out from this has just been like chef's kiss, beautiful art. Um, what originally sold me on the book was in some of like the pre-marketing of everything. I'm not sure who put it out or where I saw it. I mean, I saw it on Instagram, but I'm not sure who posted it. It was saying that it was like the mummy or like the vibe of the mummy. And then for the life of me, I couldn't find it again. But of course, I go onto Ibanez's website and let me just read the little blurb that she's got here about the book. A divine exploration, a deadly secret, a desire she can't escape. The Mummy meets Death on the Nile in this lush, immersive, historical fantasy set in Egypt filled with adventure, a rival to lovers, romance, and a villain who stays 3 steps ahead. Like most people my age, I am obsessed with The Mummy. And I think at the time I had been like actively searching for new ways to get that same high. As much as I love this book, I don't think that that was necessarily an apt comparison. I think I was definitely, this, I guess, goes on my expectations of what I wanted out of it, which is I wanted something that was definitely more of like O'Connell and Evie's kind of romance. And like the little blurb said, this is definitely more like rivals to lovers or kind of like not full enemies to lovers, but there's like a conflict between them that is not okay, spoiler, is not resolved by the end of the first book. Um, whereas at the end of the first Mummy, Evie and O'Connell are like the treasure that they found at Hamunaptra. I mean, you can't beat that kind of romance. So that was something that I was seeking, but that in no means like tampered my enjoyment of this book. So if you head over to my Goodreads, you will see that I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. Um, and I've talked previously about how I have a really hard time, I guess, deciding on what my scale actually is. But overall, I just try not to be too hypercritical. I think there's definitely a time and a place for that. And in book reviews, that's just not where I choose to be that's my own preference. That's my own prerogative. I don't want to be too hypercritical. I definitely had like a few qualms with things, which I will get into, but it was never anything where it like was detrimental to my experience of the book. A few key points. One, just luscious plot because it's like a very character driven plot, and the characters themselves were really, really thought out. You can tell that Ibanez put a lot of work into how these characters were as individuals and then kind of how that was going to be necessary to pushing the plot forward, which I really enjoyed. Um, I guess without skipping ahead too much, I might as well just kind of set the scene here, like what's going on. Um, so the book starts in the prologue with Inez living with her aunt and her 2 cousins. They are well off in Argentina. Um, she lives with them because her parents spend 6 months out of the year in Egypt doing archaeology with her uncle. So living with, I want to say, father's sister, mom and dad are in Egypt with mom's brother, Tio Ricardo. Um, we get like a nice like chunk of prologue where we're establishing that Inez would love to go to Egypt with her parents, how much she resents them for being there for so long of her life. I mean, half of her life, because they do it 6 months every year and they've done it almost her entire life. And then kind of resents Egypt as much as she wants to love it because it feels like Egypt is stealing her parents from her, and like the work that they're doing there is keeping them from her. So we establish that. We establish her relationship with her cousins, her relationship with her aunt, who really wants her to be like a proper lady and get married to, I want to say it's like the ambassador's son. You know, they're just setting up this perfect life for her. And then at the end of the prologue, um, sorry, I just wanted to make sure. I'm trying to remember if I did the spoiler warning. I did. At the end of the prologue, she gets a letter from her parents. She gets a letter, I should say. She's fully convinced it's her parents telling her that she can finally come and join them. But actually, it is her uncle telling her that her parents have died. Tragic. I mean, you going into the chapter, you kind of are expecting that it was, it was too easy. You got to set up the plot somehow. But it's still terrible to read. She's like 17. I think she's 18 when the book officially starts in chapter one, which is like a few months later. She set up all this resentment in the prologue, and you're thinking, okay, that's what's got to play out. And it is kind of like that. The resolution of some of that resentment is fully what needs to play out, but it's not gonna resolve itself, of course, in the way that would be a normal human, straightforward way for that to play out. So I guess jumping ahead, we are at like, November of that year. It's historical fantasy. It's set during the same time period as The Mummy was set. In that respect, it's the same kind of like setting I would give it as The Mummy. And she has this little magic ring it was kind of like her last gift from her father with no letter, no explanation, nothing. And it becomes this kind of like totem for a little bit in the book until it's like conveniently stolen by a bad person, because it's that connection to her father and to the work that her parents were doing, but also it becomes a way for like us, the reader, to kind of understand the way that magic works in this world. Um, it's unclear, I would say, how it starts in terms of how it works. So by the time like the present day of the book comes around, magic is really, really dwindling, but there's certain objects where like magic is really, really ripe in it and they can do things. So like a few examples from the book is like Tio Ricardo's tie. It If you squeeze it will eject like boiling water, which they use to make tea when they're on like doing field work. They've got a suitcase where like you open and close it and you get like fresh sudsy water, and so they use that to do the dishes. But then there's some weird things where like there was a chair that her father acquired that I think was like floating around and just like wouldn't stay seated and was wreaking havoc in their home. So there's not really clarity on how to get magic into those objects, but also that's kind of, I guess, the point is that even at this point in their history, magic is such a mystery to them that it's really rare basically to find something that was as powerfully magicked as the ring that she had was. And she was fully convinced that it was like a fake from one of the bazaars or something in Cairo or in Alexandria. And what we come to find out later on is that this actually was connected to Cleopatra, and Cleopatra's tomb kind of becomes like um a focal point of the conflict that's brewing here. Which I'll try not to get too deep into. I will obviously, again, like it's going to be spoilers along the way, but I don't want to give everything away. So okay, if we want to talk about this being again character-driven book, Inez, the main character, she's very young, and I'm moving further and further away from reading, or at least I'm trying to. Somehow I just keep stumbling into it, and I think it's because of the authors that I'm familiar with at this point. Um, she does occasionally some very immature choices. She makes some immature choices, and I think that's part of the reason that I have a hard time reading main characters that are on the younger side because in some ways it can feel like the miscommunication trope in that like, well, if you were slightly more mature, we could have had like an actual conversation about this and it actually wouldn't have been a conflict. Um, I will say though, her youth is not the reason that I think that mistake keeps happening because her uncle is also very poor at making those kinds of decisions as well. And he's older. He's I want to say older than her mother was. And so she's, freshly 18 and he's a middle-aged man. And there's no reason that he needs to be making those choices as well. Um, but the flip side of this is that as rash and sometimes like almost illogical as she can be, she's also extremely brave. She travels from Argentina straight across to Egypt all on her own. She lies and pretends that she is a widow so that way she can travel alone without question. And then she gets to Egypt and we meet the uh, male potential love interest. And he thinks that he's just gonna, stick her back on a boat and stick her and send her straight back to Argentina. And without really even considering it, she's just like, no, thank you. And she runs off and she makes her way to the hostel, across the desert in a train, but she's still in a new country, nobody there to help her. At that point, had lost all of her luggage because she left it with him, with Whit. And she doesn't really second guess it. She's got her goal. She's got the plan in her head, which continually breaks because she doesn't actually know what she's doing, but it doesn't stop her. And I love that. I love that she just sticks to her guns and she really like sticks out the scary parts. But that whole situation introduces us to Whit. Whit is um he's a conflicting character because obviously at first, as the reader, you want to support Inez's antics. Wit, however, immediately is introduced as like opposed to that. And then as we learn more about him, he's, her uncle's lackey, and her uncle is also kind of a force in the way of the goals to figure out how her parents died. I guess I should also mention the whole goal for her is to find out what happened to her parents. She's not given any clarity. She's not her uncle specifically should have given her something more. And that was like that's the big part where I'm like, if you'd just been more mature with this whole issue, then we probably wouldn't have ended up where we ended up. Um, so she's traveled to Egypt not because of just, well, I never got to go when my parents were here. It's finally my time. She travels to Egypt because she's got it in her head that she's going to personally solve her parents' murders. And that is so cocky. And it's just the kind of cockiness that a young person without any experience in the world could possibly have. And I mean, like, I love that. And we wouldn't have a book if it weren't for that. So in that respect, again, if we're kind of hopping back to it's frustrating to read somebody who's young and regularly making illogical choices, we wouldn't have a book otherwise. So sorry, back to what. So his name is Whitford Hayes. Throughout the book, we kind of find out more of his history, and we find out that he was part of, I want to say, the British Army working in Egypt, and he's kind of got like a survivor's guilt going on, and he's introduced, and he's like a very heavy alcoholic, which is never attractive in my opinion. But they resolve it very quickly, which is nice because I remember making notes and I was like, actually, this is not hot at all. But then almost like immediately, I shouldn't say immediately, pretty soon into their conflict, into the plot, we find out that he's kind of been forced to quit drinking. So he again, is introduced as this force in the way of her goals to find out what happened to her parents. But slowly we kind of figure out that it's not so much that he doesn't want her to find out. I think there's a level of him just being like, it's not my business, but following what her uncle wants him to do. And that's fair because again, later we find out how low in life, like the rock bottom that Whit had hit before Tio Ricardo found him and kind of pulled him out of out of the trenches, mentally speaking. Um, and part of me is like, this is on both sides, there's too much mess for this to work. But I think what ends up happening is by the end, there's like just enough mess between them for them to understand each other and to like see each other as equals in a way, and that like equals of, I guess, like of suffering. And I think at the beginning, part of the reason that like Wit doesn't really care to help Inez on her, journey. One, he has no loyalty to her. He doesn't know who she is. But two, the very first thing she does is surprise him by running off and like tricking him essentially. And I think there's a level on his part of like almost jealousy that she still has that fight in her. Whereas as we kind of like learn more about him again, we find out like he's not that much older than Inez, and he's really, really been through the ringer. Um, and so I think he has a lot more caution, even though he goes out and he does bad things. He does the dirty work so that Gio Ricardo doesn't have to, but he doesn't follow himself. And that's kind of like the difference between the two of them. While he's going out and doing risky business for somebody else, for, the archaeology scene in Egypt, Inez is going out and doing risky business so that she can like resolve a big issue that she has personally. So I think the two really complement each other in that, in the like there's tension with the family and they kind of understand that imperfection and then the struggle that can develop into. And also they understand the need to push yourself further for that family because one of the conflicts for him that we find out is that his sister's been really sick. And we don't have a lot of clarity on that. I mean, we know more about his military history than we do about his family situation at this point. Some of it was kind of just like little truth bombs near the end of the book that haven't been fully established or expanded on yet. But I think he sees the youthful kind of hope and rashness in her, and he doesn't try to make her be smaller, which I really liked. And that kind of brings me to Tio Ricardo, who I have a lot of problems with. He's not the bad guy in the book. He is just a bad guy, I think. Um, we are led to believe through Inez that he might have murdered her parents, or he's working with like, because I should say also like a big subplot of this is ethics and archaeology. The like early archaeologists love to dig a bunch, find a bunch of shit, and then sell it. Do not look into what they used to do to mummies. Um, and so when Tio Ricardo is introduced, we find out that he is like super, super uh prominent within the like ethics community there. Not, he doesn't really have a good name for himself, but he's kind of known for being overly cautious, overly, oh, what's the word? Like conservative in the sense of like conservation. Um, because at this point in the history, again, historical fantasy, in this point in the histories, Egypt has kind of entirely been taken over by England. And so a bunch of British guys are coming in claiming to be archaeologists, but all they want to do is sell this stuff. And he is fighting tooth and nail to not have that happen and to actually have the histories preserved and have these like final resting places respected. And in that respect, Tio Ricardo is a decent person in my book. Like that alone would have made him a good person, except for the way that he treats Inez. It's just terrible. He talks down to her and he belittles her, and he's got a temper problem to begin with. And so we find like we get that right away, which of course is kind of setting him up as a red herring, which is really frustrating. But it's out in public, he's having dinner with people, and he's like noticeably seething at Inez. And I don't think it's like I think it's obvious that he's a red herring because all of his actions would have been too complex for somebody pretending to care about the archaeology and the history and the preservation versus somebody like actually caring. He clearly actually cared about preserving the sites. And if he had been secretly caring that much, or if he'd been caring that much just so he could secretly be selling stuff, it just wouldn't make sense. It would be too convoluted at that point. Um, but okay, big spoiler. So I'm not going to timestamp this because I'm talking in circles, but big spoiler here. The big, big thing that I wish he had been honest with Inez about is that her parents are not confirmed dead. Everyone thinks they're dead because that's what he decided to tell everybody. But what we find out is that her mother had been cheating with somebody. I want to say it was back in Cairo. And she had been the one selling everything. She had been the one who was documenting all of their finds. And so, of course, it was the easiest job for her to use her scarf that conveniently shrunk things to hide certain finds. And then they would go back to Cairo, and she would go back regularly, but she would go back to Cairo and she would sell these things to like this underground network of private collectors that were willing to pay quite a lot of money. She is discovered doing this and having an affair with somebody who's in this underground network. And of course, breaks her husband's heart. And then they run off somehow and they just aren't found. So when her uncle told her that her parents died, there was not proof, it was just assumed, which fair assumption if they'd just run off, but knowing all of the conflict that was happening around that, you had to have known that there was some expectation that she didn't actually die and that she ran off. On top of that, partway into the fieldwork, who should stumble into Inez's tent in the middle of the first night, I think it is? It's her mom. So it just further proves to Inez not to trust her uncle, who she's already decided not to trust. And that's I can understand thinking that you need to keep some of it under wraps, but you don't have to tell her that like, oh, sorry, your mom broke your family up. When you tell her your parents are missing, we don't have a body, it's entirely possible. Like you don't have to just say they're dead without the proof and then hope that it works out for you because it didn't work out for him. And so that's really frustrating because he decides not to trust Inez and he decides to hold her her inheritance over her. He's the one who, because he couldn't be honest and because I guess to some level he wanted to protect the family legacy or the family name, or he wanted to keep the money to himself. I'm not sure what his motivations were behind it. he really like set the stage for all of the dominoes to fall and for her mom to get away, for her cousin to die. I'm not even going to tell you how that happens. Um, for her to God, I mean, she gets her heart broken brutally by her mom. And kind of like there's like a big one, and then it just kind of like repeats. It just kind of like cycles through like a snowball. Um, but if he had just been honest with Inez, it doesn't even have to be from the beginning. The second she showed up in Egypt and he realized that he couldn't send her away, he should have been at least partially honest with her about the situation. Um, so obviously I have a lot of feelings about Tio Ricardo not uh being more forthcoming with his information. And then the last character that I want to talk about is actually Inez's mom. She is an excellent character study in how to make somebody completely irredeemable. I've kind of talked about her, with each little character and everything, but so when we find out that her mom is actually alive, there was this moment where I was like, is this like a ghost? Like, magic is real in this world, and they're currently in an archaeological site. That's kind of where they were staying. So is it possible that her mom is not really there, and maybe it's a dream, or maybe it's just like through the magic of the site or whatever. But no, her mom's really there. And it's the way that her mom betrays her that just makes it so much worse. In order to ensure that her daughter knows that she's been betrayed, the night that they were supposed to escape, they've got all their bags packed, they're getting on a boat, and then her mom, while standing on the boat, is conveniently like, "Oh my God, I forgot my motion sickness medicine. I can't travel without it." Um, and she describes this little baggie or little, like coin purse style that she always keeps it in. Inez is like, I'll go back and I'll track our steps and I'll try to find it. She finds it, she comes back. The boat is, half a mile up the river already. They're specks. They're gone. And she opens the little pack and she pulls out, there's no medicine there. She pulls out a note from her mom that basically just says, don't come looking for me. You won't like what you find. She couldn't have just like not shown up to the meet or not done all of the theatrics, but what like it was just like so premeditated. It was so planned and thought out. It wasn't like I'll just tell her when we get to the beach, kind of like she cares, so she doesn't want to think about it too hard. No, she fully thought out how she was going to trick Inez into not going on the boat, which also just doesn't feel necessary. She could have brought Inez back to Alexandria or like sent her back to Argentina thinking that they'd won. And then back in Argentina, she could have been, I don't, but she really, really like destroyed Inez's heart with that. Um, and then, she's got to deal with the fallout of thinking for weeks that her mom was the good guy and helping her mom. Um, and in so doing, betraying her uncle, which her uncle's partner, whose name escapes me, and then the rest of the dig team. I can't say that in her situation, I would have chosen, the quote unquote right choice, but it had to have been suspicious at some point. Like Inez is so scared when she's trying to help her mom, and that should have been a clue to her. And that's what's so frustrating is like she's so young that she's not trusting her body in the way that she should be. Um, she's just trusting that her mom has her best interest, and she doesn't, unfortunately. So that was kind of like I guess the climax of the book is that betrayal. And so, just really if going from the beginning where Inez wants nothing more than to follow her parents, go with her parents to Egypt, to losing her parents, to getting her mom back, but then to lose her mom in an entirely different way. The idea of her mom, the comfort of who her mom represents to her. Um, that was really, really rough to read. Real fun. Like in a God, I love books that wreck me kind of way. Um, yeah, I think that's all I'll talk about for now. The second book is coming out in just a few months. It's at this point just supposed to be a duology. Um, Overall thoughts, reiterate, I don't think the Mummy comparison was as fleshed out or as clear as I would have liked. Um, Obviously that was super important to me. I'm not sure why I'm that hung up on it. Two, very, very rich characters and very rich plot because of that, because it's the you can't have a character-driven plot without really complex and deep characters. Another thing, which is, I guess, like a note on in my book is, God, I'm gonna compare it to the Mummy again. In the Mummy, Imhotep and Hamunaptra and that whole conflict is kind of like Mod Podge of things. It's not like real quotes here for all of the audio listeners. Um, but having like Cleopatra, I think at times felt familiar, but at other times it was so like recognizable that it, I guess, kind of took away from some of the magic of the situation. Um, yeah, I think the perk in the Mummy of having it be like this just general, you know, not real conflict is that it just exists within that versus me knowing things about Cleopatra as somebody who studied ancient Egypt and then also reading this. I guess it's kind of there's like a little dissonance there, which was frustrating as a reader. Um, but yeah, that I mean, that's small. That's so hyper specific to my experience as somebody who went into academia, into humanities, and then as eventually a reader of this book. Um, I love this book. I would say for I guess the speed round is very light smut. They are still rivals at the end, even after they've made out, but we don't get anything more than over the pants. So I would grade this as like an adult in that it was more than I would be comfortable reading about two teenagers. Um, and also they are adults in the book. Uh, Three, light fantasy. So you're not learning like a whole new magic universe or system or whatever it is. It's very, very subtle. It's integral to the plot only because of the way that it functions, uh, with like the connection to Inez. But there's not like you don't have to learn an entirely new system. And I guess that's the perk of historical fantasy is you just kind of assumptions are made. Um, Three, no, this is four. I'm even holding up four fingers. Four, the banter between Inez and Whitford is really fun. And it's not banter in like, they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, but there's occasionally a moment within the banter where the other person surprises the other in a way that I think was enjoyable. Um, I think enjoyable may be too light of a word for that. I guess they surprise each other regularly in a way that shows how uh close they're becoming. It's almost this act of intimacy with them. And it's fun to see them stretch that line a little bit further every single time. But I think that's it. I like this book. This was a 5-star read for me. Um, I'm excited for the next book to come out. I've been telling everybody about it, and I've been leaving the addendum. It is only a duology, and book 2 is out before the end of the year. And then I guess if you want to see more of me, then check out the links below. If you're listening to the audio version, make sure to subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And then if you are watching this on YouTube, hit the bell, get notified when I randomly decide to upload episodes because this is a one-woman show and I'm very bad at doing the audio edits on these fast enough to get them out in time. So it's a surprise for everyone, myself included. Hopefully, hopefully that'll improve over the next year. But thank you. Thank you everyone for joining me. And until next time, happy reading. Thank you for joining me for another episode of In Bed with Books, a bookish podcast for bookish babes. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all of the latest updates. And if you have any suggestions for authors, books, or topics that you want to hear about on the podcast, then feel free to DM me on Instagram or shoot me an email. I'm wishing you a lovely rest of your day, and until next time, happy reading.